Good morning. It's frightening. It's all on schedule. Well, where do I start? Howard Marks is on later. Internationally renowned cannabis smuggler. If he's Mr. Nice, what does that make me? Well, you've got the former operational head of Scotland Yard's drug squad arguing for legalisation across the board. You've got the former chief constable of Gwent arguing the human rights case for cannabis possession. The chief constable of Cumbria arguing for legalisation. Cleveland Police Authority with their deputy chief constable telling government that prohibition's failing and legalisation should be assessed. Deputy Assistant Commissioner in the Metropolitan Police arguing that successful prohibition enforcement would totally swamp civil liberties. We've got to think the unthinkable. Two chief officers from the UK were on the Runciman report, allying themselves to potential decriminalisation of cannabis. And despite some of his comments, the National Drug Czar, formerly a chief constable, but one thing he has done is clarify that possession is not a priority. Let me also deal with the Exodus Collective, the community in Cambridge, where the local uniform superintendent, chief superintendent, has been supportive of them. That's fine, but how many chief superintendents do you know whose previous career was drummer in a pop group? It's not the traditional career course for a senior policeman. You're entitled to be confused about these attitudes and these comments because this is the agency that's enforcing the legislation. But they're a logical approach. Today you're going to hear a variety of speakers talking from their own background. They're going to look at legalisation, particularly of cannabis. I'm deliberately going to look at it from a policing point of view for a variety of reasons, one of which is on all the lobbying groups and all the various websites and all the books, I do not see many of the arguments that the police service has taken into account when they've moved towards this point of view. I'll try and explain policing's attitudes and how they've evolved over the years. And in due course, you'll discern without a shadow of a doubt what my own point of view is. Now, in any examination of a period of change, you've got to have a start point. And in common with many other revolutions, the revolution in the approach to cannabis and the revolution of change in the police service it started in the 60s. That's almost 40 years. And the arguments have changed very, very little. That's the bad news. The good news is that back in the 60s, the arguments were only put forward by very few pressure groups, very few people. Now those arguments are held good by a variety of professions, by large numbers in the community, and by a high percentage of people when they're asked about their opinions. The Soma advertisement in the Times in July 1967 presented a case for legalisation under the heading, "The law against marijuana is immoral in principle and unworkable in practice." Now, that advertisement's got itself its own established position in the history of cannabis, mainly because of the signatures that were appended to the advertisement. But there was a paragraph in that advertisement that talked about policing at the time, and if I may, I'll present to you how policing was viewed at that time. The prohibition of cannabis has brought the law into disrepute and has demoralised police officers faced with the necessity of enforcing an unjust law. Uncounted thousands of frightened persons have been arbitrarily classified as criminals and threatened with arrest, victimisation and loss of livelihood. They've been hunted down with Alsatian dogs or stopped on the street at random and improperly searched. The National Council for Civil Liberties has called attention to instances where drugs have apparently been planted on suspected cannabis smokers. Chief constables have appealed to the public to inform on their neighbours and children. Yet despite these gross impositions and the threat to civil liberties which they pose, the police freely admit they've been unable to prevent the spread of cannabis smoking. Now, on the face of it, comparing that description of policing then to the comments with which I opened, the police service has moved quite a way. But life is never, ever that simple. Within 16 months of that advertisement, the Advisory Committee on Drug Dependence published its report. You'll probably know it if you know this field as the Wotton Report or the Wotton Committee Report. In summary, they commented that the dangers of cannabis use, as commonly accepted, the risk of progression to opiates have been overstated, and current criminal sanctions are overly severe. And they concluded what amounted to a decriminalisation request in the field of cannabis. What receives little publicity, and I'll be astounded if too many people in the room are aware of it, is that a senior member of that committee was a gentleman called Peter Brodie, Sir Peter Brodie, who was the Assistant Commissioner of the Crime Department of the Metropolitan Police. Way back in the middle 60s, the most senior detective in London was arguing for decriminalisation of cannabis. It's not a question of moving from black to white in the police service's point of view. There has always been an expression that perhaps in this field the law was totally unjust. You see, even back in the 60s, there's some very limited evidence that police managers could actually think. Harking back to earlier comments about policing styles, well, it was the allegations of planting, refusal of bail in minor cases, and routine verballing. We all know verballing? That's when a policeman remembers an admission of guilt that the defendant later forgets before court. This situation gave rise to the establishment of Release, an organisation dedicated to protecting the rights of drug users and their families. And just in case, like many of the media, you think my conversion has occurred since retirement, I could point out that I went on to the drug squad in 71 or 72 with the total qualification that I'd never arrested anybody for a case of drug possession in my life prior to that moment. I went on the squad because the previous squad was suspended pending trial with allegations of recycling. I've never, ever, from the first instance on the drug squad, been able to see the drug user of any commodity in my eyes as a criminal. Every policeman looks at every offence under law, and in his own eyes, in his own personal viewpoint, he grades them from the most minor offence to the most senior offence. I have never been able to grab the idea that a drug user was a criminal in my eyes. And within 2 years of getting on the drug squad, that first instance was a 4-year posting, I was associated with Release and contributing to writing one of the chapters in what was then called the Trucker's Bible, which was a guide to smuggling of drugs around the world. In a different way to my profession, who saw it as encouragement to smuggle drugs, I actually saw it as crime prevention. It identified the dangers of taking drugs into a variety of different countries. It talked about the penalties, and at no point did it tell you how to get around the smuggling. It basically said, this is dangerous, please don't do it. I saw that in the very early days as crime prevention, contributed then. I was delighted a couple of years ago when Release approached me to be a trustee. Indeed, until Rob Cannabis entered the Glastonbury Bloom competition with his plants a couple of years ago, I thought I was unique. Back in 1973, not only did I enter a cannabis plant in a horticultural show, but the horticultural show was held at New Scotland Yard. We weren't quite sure which category of the horticultural show to enter it in, but when we examined it, it was perfectly clear that it was a category called single pot plant. So we entered it in that and then got disqualified because the judge said it was a vegetable. So how does the police service get from the Times allegations of oppressive planting to becoming legalisation lobbyists? You'll be very pleased but not surprised to know that the blame lies entirely with the Home Office. You'll recognise the refrain, the blame lies with education, education, education. The previous history of police management and leadership was military. Senior officers were commonly drawn from the military. The training took place at military establishments, and the police, through their leaders, did their duty. They knew their place, they did as they were told, unswerving loyalty to the Crown and government, and end up with a medal. Give us a problem, we can do it. Give us the manpower, give us the resources, we can solve the problem. It was the mantra right through the 60s and the 70s. Drunk driving, give us the law, give us a breathalyzer. Organised crime in East London, no problem, Mr Home Secretary, our former gangbuster team. The great train robbers, how dare they mess with the Royal Mail, 30 years at least. Robberies in London, the flying squad's here. Drugs, have a drug squad. Pornography, have a pornographic squad. Superficially, it was all fine. The public knew their place. The police were above reproach. We all trusted policemen. Fine body of men. The 40s, the 50s, the 60s, it was all plain sailing. Then, what was below the surface started to bubble out. The start of internal investigations through the 60s brought out allegations of recycling by the drug squad, financial corruption by the pornography barons, very senior detectives implicated in that. Acceptable, overwhelming evidence of tampering with evidence in major trials, leaders out of touch with community needs, the amalgamation through the Local Government Act of lots of small police forces into large organisations. We had these big companies with no trained, experienced managers or leaders of sufficient quality. Worst of all was an emerging recognition that neither the police or indeed any other single agency could solve any problem without cooperation between the agencies. And I can assure you at that time the police service had no reputation whatsoever for cooperation. So the Home Office made the decision in the mid-60s to educate the police service, a combination of higher calibre recruits, the National Police Training College in Hampshire, specialist training, training for future responsibilities, skills such as financial management, town planning, the benefits of multi-agency approach, the use of technology, media training, deploying and understanding research departments, an evolution of the original legislation. It was a revolution in police training. What had previously been a job became a profession, with all the accompanying accoutrements, qualifications, selection, interchange between police forces, graduated career through small, through rural, through town, and then up to city police forces. But with all this came another development. If your manager can think, if he can research, if he can canvass opinions, if he works with other agencies, he might actually come up with an answer that's not what he was told to do. And that's the present strain within the policing service. The current crop of leaders are concluding that certainly in the drugs field, there are options for change that might well be beneficial to police and to public, but they're not the currently expressed will of government. And policing has got a very real problem with this. Constitutionally in the UK, the police are the servants of the public through government. I certainly, and you may well agree with me, I do not want to be in a country where the police are responsible for enacting the legislation. There are countries in the world where the police or the military control the legislation, control the judiciary. That's not the UK model, and it's not one I'd argue for. Senior police managers generally want to retain the situation where the police remain subservient to government and people. Now, in order to maintain that balance, it's extremely difficult for an entire profession to come out and argue that governments potentially got it wrong. There are things that they can do. Policing's always had an input into lawmaking. At the research level, they're invited to comment before the laws are enacted. And there's a feedback loop. If government enacts legislation and practical policing discovers that it's got failings, that it hasn't been written correctly, or there's an imbalance, you can feedback the experiences and get amendments put through. That's always been there. But we've got no precedent for policing ever to go back to government and say you got it wrong. We've always been there to feedback and say, could you change it this way? There's never been a precedent for coming and saying, terribly sorry, you might have made a mistake. If experience shows that the policy of prohibition has got certain failings, policing cannot, under the UK model, impose a law change on government. What it can do, and you might think that such processes are already underway, is respond operationally to changing social standards. Policing can reduce the specific manpower dedicated to any one problem. It can respond by identifying priorities. And when you say, this is important to me, what you're inherently saying is, that's not as important. And you will discover that certain priorities around the world at the moment, and certainly across the UK, priorities are not drug policing. It can openly discuss options. It can hold conferences where debates can be leaked, that other options as opposed to prohibition can be discussed. It can produce the accurate data for others to make the argument, and it can reflect the emerging public mood by promoting cautions instead of prosecution. But if police managers are moving towards such changed priorities, then there must have been some factors that they'd taken into consideration to get there. And today I'd like to share them with you, because they're not the ones that are generally underpinning the legalisation arguments. They're the practical, pragmatic arguments. Let me introduce you to the reason why we have police. The primary object of an efficient police is the prevention of crime. The next, the detection and apprehension of an offender once a crime has been committed. There's nothing new in that. It's been unchanged since 1829, when the then police commissioner in London documented that. It's an important equation. Prevention is first. If a crime has been committed, policing has failed. We all think of policing in terms of catch the baddie after he's committed it. It is prevention that is paramount. If we can prevent the crime committed, then policing is successful. If the crime takes place, policing has failed. In the case of nearly all other crimes away from drugs, the general pattern is that a crime takes place, the public report it, quite often the victim. The police investigate, but they look at the pattern of crimes. And if a pattern emerges, the police attempt to be there to prevent it happening again through more patrolling, or alternatively to target the person responsible. The idea is that if it takes place, we prevent in future by an arrest or by prevention by a greater presence. The organisation keeps a record of all the crimes reported and keeps a record of all the crimes solved. Police efficiency is measured by a comparison of the crimes and the level of crime committed compared to the level of crimes solved or the reduction in the number of crimes committed. Drug work totally ruins all that. Back in those revolutionary 60s, drug arrests weren't even recorded as crime. They were recorded for statistical purposes only. The title of my talk today is exactly the same as the approach to drugs through the 60s. Drugs, cannabis, it's not a real crime, is it? Not only in the view of the policeman, but in the view of the statisticians, in the view of the Home Office, it was never a recorded crime. It never affected the crime rate, and the arrest never affected the clear-up rate. It was never a measure of police efficiency until about 3 years ago. The importance of drugs in the Metropolitan Police can be easily assessed through the 60s and the 70s. The Yard's flying squad, which concentrated on robberies, was almost 300 strong. While the drug squad, of which I was a member both at junior rank and then as the operational head, that much protested against, much fought against, much alleged against, the drug squad was 27 strong for the whole of London. That level of commitment from the Metropolitan Police existed until the early 1980s, when Mrs. Thatcher decided to see if more manpower would assist, and she threw more men at it. So what does a police manager do? Now it's a recordable crime. Create yourself a drug squad, make a few hundred arrests, the crime rate goes up by a few hundred crimes. It cancels out all the efforts of your community policing, all the efforts of the domestic violence unit, and the general public are now aware that they've got a drug problem. No knowledge of drugs means no problem. Active policing brings it to notice and makes even more demands. This isn't a new debate. Despite being youngsters on the squad back in the early 70s, we had this debate amongst ourselves, and we decided to test it. So we looked for an area of London that had no drug problem, but it was an identifiable area that we could carry out an experiment. And you may or may not know it, but there's a new town on the Kent-Surrey borders south of London called New Addington. It's outside of Croydon, it's a new estate. It's got absolutely everything you would want for your community. It's got a community centre, a youth club, its own police station, its local newspaper. Local police community relations are good, they meet regularly. No drug problem and a very low crime rate. At least it did in the 70s. So we put a couple of officers in and they asked a few questions and they got to know the area. And they came back and they said, it's not bad. We've got an active amphetamine circulation operating through discos and parties, and 3 or 4 of the youngsters were making a few bob at it. So we did our experiment. We went in, we arrested 2 or 3 people, and we seized a fair bit of amphetamine. And suddenly New Addington had a drug problem. What was peaceful and quiet until then suddenly had a major drug problem. They were calling in the local police demanding action. The local police were right into the yard asking for attention from the drug squad. The local newspapers were identifying the problem. People were doing personal interviews in the newspaper talking about the drug problem and my child is at risk. We'd created it. We'd totally created it. There was no drug problem in New Addington until we started making some efforts there. So we responded in traditional style. We went down there and told everybody we would work extremely hard, did nothing, and the problem went away. Now, that managerial dilemma occurs in the field of drugs to every single police manager across the United Kingdom. Couple that problem in an ever-increasing requirement for resources, and add to that the potential for police corruption, and you've got an even bigger problem. I'll call it police corruption, but you must all be aware that any corruption requires 2 parties to work together. In drug policing, anywhere in the world, corruption will, has, and is sure to again occur. There are a variety of management structures you can take to counter that, one of which is to deploy a small, dedicated, trained team, well led to operate in the field. This is the route chosen by most police forces. Most organisations, most police services in the United Kingdom have got a small, dedicated squad. It's better to supervise, it's better to select, and provided you've got somebody of integrity leading it, then you've got every chance of it remaining on the straight and narrow. It works on specific intelligence, it works to targeting, it works to interrupting the flow, it wants to create chaos in the supply chain, it wants to achieve its end product of deterrence, which is the basic reason for prohibition, I'd suggest. It wants to achieve its end product of deterrence through major seizures with as few of these allegations of crime as possible, because we don't want to spoil the image given to the public of the crime rate, but we want to get the maximum publicity for the minimum amount of arrests. And using a dedicated team to make arrests and to break up the supply chain is the way most police services are going. Quality, not quantity, is the motto at the moment. Why does corruption occur in this field? Well, there's a variety of reasons. It's easy to say there's loads and loads of money around, and that's clearly true. I'd suggest there's another reason, that in all other crime there are 3 constituent parts. There's the baddie, there's the victim, and there's the policeman. And if any 2 get together to try and thwart the aims of justice, then the other person notices. If the baddie and the victim get together and decide not to take it any further, the policeman starts getting suspicious and looks for a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. If the baddie and the policeman get together for their own ends, the victim goes to a complaints investigation department and says, what's going on here? So there's always somebody else to bring it to notice. But in the drugs field, there's only 2. There is baddie and policeman. And if for their own ends they both see it beneficial to combine, usually in the case of the policeman it's for financial gain, and in the case of the baddie he doesn't want to go to prison, quite understandably, then there's no third party, and police management's got to take that role. So the police manager's got the potential for creating more and more demands on his resources, because when he does work it brings the problem to notice and people demand more work. He's got the potential for corruption on his officers. What a combination. It's not difficult to discern that most police managers are quite happy not to get involved in the field of drugs. But that's not all. The resource demands are not only on the policemen, it's on the courts and the laboratories. In London in the early 1990s, I was absolutely delighted to write the Metropolitan Briefing that gave guidance on cautioning. It had nothing whatsoever to do with my own personal beliefs or possibly the beliefs of many people here today. It was entirely that if we carried on at the rate we were going, the Metropolitan Police Forensic Science Laboratory could not have investigated major cases other than drugs, because more and more of the laboratory's resources were put into analysis of drugs. The reality of cautioning was that it lay more in the husbandry of resources rather than any assessment of legalisation. Organisationally, the service did progress. Efficiencies came in. The National Drugs and Illegal Immigration Intelligence Unit provided IT backing for information. I'll leave it to others to identify and justify, or otherwise, why the drugs and illegal immigration were bracketed together in one single unit. The drug squad work was harmonised with that of Her Majesty's Customs and Excise because most of the products get smuggled into this country. And through the evolution of organisation came the National Criminal Intelligence Service and the National Crime Squad. And through all this was a continuing problem of performance measurement. Everybody in public service that's getting paid by the public has to produce performance measures. Well, do greater seizures indicate better work, or do they indicate a runaway market? Do numbers arrested indicate greater successes, or the greater number breaking the law? I haven't got an answer. The politicians don't have an answer, and it's the press department of each police service that decides on the day how they're going to present the information. But the data was being collected for the first time. And remember, we've now got trained senior officers who are allowed to think. They've been through the training courses and they're allowed to research and they're allowed to think. And they discovered some other things. Not only does drug work use up resources, it ruins your results and the output of your performances. It increases public anxiety and invites a threat of corruption. It's a wonderful field to work in. Then it was discovered that half the crime committed had a drug connection. That there'll always be crimes committed by individuals whose lack of commitment to society as a whole is reinforced or denigrated by the use of drug. That's an individual who may well be a criminal irrespective of his drug use. And those crimes will always continue to be committed, whether drugs are here or not, because it's the individual. But there's a large proportion of crimes, and the suggestion under the research is that it's almost half of them, are being committed, the acquisitive crime, to pay for individual drug use. And that equation has become more and more apparent over the last decade. So now we find prohibition keeps the price up. We've got a wave of secondary victims of drug use, all the victims of crime. And all those victims of crime are paying for drug use. They are drug victims. So add it all up together, and you can appreciate why the police service, despite its traditional conservatism, is considering other options, other policies. You will, I'm absolutely sure, have noticed the absence of any elements in that argument of any individual rights or any sympathy for the drug user. Police managers are pragmatic, and the priorities are the 3 R's. It's resources, results, and repercussions, because they're the 3 things that guide the manager. So why in this particular field does law and order fail? And in failing, why does it affect everybody else? The British model is policing by consent. But when you've got drug use being acceptable to so many people, the people multiplied in number that are breaking the legislation, we're already at the point where we're not policing by consent, certainly in the field of cannabis. We're not deterring. By any research, the number of users in all categories of drug use is growing alarmingly. And I choose the word alarmingly quite deliberately. Being an advocate of legalisation and not prohibition does not make me in favour of growing drug use, even in the cannabis field. What I'm after is a policy capable of delivering low-level use with the least detrimental effect on others in society. So what does prohibition do? Well, it puts possession and supply outside authorised control. We can't control the products or control price by normal market economics. The first failing ensures that every single year, by leaving quality control to the criminal market, we've got serious illness and occasional deaths by products getting on the market too pure or too adulterated. The second failing gives the monopoly to the group less trustworthy than any other, the same criminals. We guarantee through prohibition that criminals will have no authorised competition. Supply and price controlled by criminals, and we give it to them. We guarantee that all the profits in the trade flow to those least deserving of that money. The illegal drug trade internationally is now the equivalent of the international tourism trade. That's a lot of bread. It's absolute madness. By retaining prohibition, we've abandoned the market, handed control to crime, profits to crime, handed price to crime. We've got, in exchange, the high price underpins more than half the crime committed to the ordinary members of the public, committed to raise cash to support youth. We've pushed the funding into police, customs, laboratories, courts and prisons, and staff counselling, treatment, education and health. We've alienated each succeeding generation who look at the prohibition of young pleasurable drugs as quite hypocritical, imposed by a society tolerant, even enthusiastic, and financially supported by alcohol and tobacco. And we've witnessed regular corruption of police and customs by the flow of excess money available to crime. And even more, We buttress prohibition and we moralise against needle exchange. We condemn the caring workers in the field who try and minimise harm, and we try and portray them as being in competition with prohibition. We limit education to avoiding use, knowing at least 50% of the people we're talking to don't need education on avoiding, they need education on using it more safely. And more, we've been caught out in quite a big lie. The difference between bluffing and lying is all a matter of timing. What was a bluff in the 60s and the early 70s, the statement, drugs kill, don't do drugs, was a bluff because not many people knew too much about it. But now as education's continued and people do know about drugs, we know it's a lie. Drugs don't kill. Bad drugs kill. Bad use of drugs kill. Ignorance kills, infection kills, competition between drug dealers kills, and lack of funding for treatment kills. The drug itself is inanimate. The drug isn't criminal, the user isn't criminal, it's the way we're enforcing the legislation that's creating the crime. And here in the United Kingdom, allegedly one of the claimed seats of democracy, we can't get an open, honest debate with politicians. Debates taking place in Holland, in Germany, in Switzerland, in Spain, in Belgium, some of the American states, across Canada and Australia, but not in the United Kingdom. Is it just possible over here that it's lack of knowledge and ignorance that's buttressing prohibition? It's just possible the real fear of debate's a true fear of assessment of the current policies. Transform certainly, through the National Audit Office, they're asking for a value for money assessment of the drugs legislation. We're putting all this money in government, what are you getting out of it? Perhaps we should also ask the question 30 years on from the Wootton Committee report, why this debate's been neglected, avoided and condemned, and in the meantime, many careers have been blighted, reputations destroyed, and many, many young people have been imprisoned. So what has been achieved over these years? There have been moves in the right direction. First of all, and probably most important of all, we should recognise the promoters of medicinal use for their selflessness and the dignity of their debate. After that, if decriminalisation, you recognise as a decision not to prosecute, then we've got about 85% decriminalisation through cautioning. Decriminalisation delivered by the police service through the flexibility of the current UK constitution. If you perceive, as I do, a big difference between individual use and commercial criminal supply, then you've got that because the police service is targeting criminal supply. That's where the resources are being aimed. If you recognise that a national discussion about policy alternatives is important to any profession, the police service is one of the few professions to have openly discussed it at national level. If you think, as I do, that short of legalisation, cannabis should be the very lowest priority of any residual policing, then you've got that as well, whether it be the National Drugs Law or the chief officers. If you think mandatory fines for simple possession of cannabis, as proposed by Anne Widdecombe, should be totally ridiculed and identified as impractical, then that was done within days by the police service, from the top right through to the Police Federation at the bottom. If you think voluntary referral for treatment is a better way of dealing with people than prosecution, that's already underway. The pilots were conducted by the police service across the country, working with social services, and it's being spread. If you think leaders in a concerned profession should actually look at all the alternatives on behalf of the public and government, that is and will continue to be done by the police service. Now, if I can identify that, and I'm proud to identify that, as work done by the police service, then I'll invite yourselves to think of any other major changes over the last 30 years that have occurred towards legalisation. I have a basic worry that since the main thrust of the legalisation debate is based upon personal rights and personal individual demands, that might not be the way to change government's point of view. What is really needed, just as it was in the early 60s, any one agency can't deliver. It's time for a multi-agency approach again, in effect an alliance, with all the different agencies working together in the production of information and data. The debate can be one, I suggest. It will be one, not by demands, but by a logical debate, a respectable debate that government can take notice of, and a movement towards legalisation. It really is time for legalisation. Thank you.